Hi, everyone. We are very excited to have Mireille Hildebrandt as our speaker today. Mireille is a research professor on interfacing law and technology at Free University of Brussels, appointed by the VUB Research Council. She is co-director of the research group on law, science, technology, and society studies, and the Faculty of Law and Criminology. She also holds the part-time chair of Smart Environments, Data Protection, and the Rule of Law at the Institute for Computing and Information Sciences at Radboud University in Netherlands. And today she is going to tell us about the framing powers of machine learning. Mireille, you can have it now.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. And put up the PowerPoint. So let me first tell you something about my background and from where this talk comes. So I have an ERC Advanced Grant project. ERC grants are given to persons in Europe for fundamental research. They're very honorable. So I'm very honored that I got this grant. It's a 5-year project. And it's a collaboration between lawyers and computer scientists. So in Brussels, I'm with the law faculty at Radboud. I'm with the computer science, with the science faculty, the computer science department. And the idea is that lawyers and computer scientists sit down together to look at the assumptions of the different disciplines. The subject is computational law, so the integration of artificial intelligence, but also things like rules as code. So let's say data-driven on the one hand and code-driven on the other hand, types of legal tech, as it's now called. They're integrated both into legal practice, so big law is using it. Federal courts are, for instance, using Westlaw Edge. There's all sorts of NLP in that. And researchers in law faculties are beginning to use this also. So we're looking at how can we make sure that when this gets integrated into the law, that it happens to the extent that, and in a way that it does not erode things like the rule of law, fundamental rights, etc. We're purposely not building a shared language because we feel that that means that both disciplines are betraying their own understanding of their discipline. The idea is to really make the effort to understand the other discipline in terms of that discipline. And that's why it's called cross-disciplinary perspectives. We have just kicked off a new journal, which again tries to bring together excellence in computer science and excellence in law, both at the practical level, so legal practitioners and people who are developing legal tech, but there's a preference for the more theoretical work. Everybody who submits a paper goes through the double-blind peer review within the own discipline. So that's law or computer science, might also be philosophy, humanities. And after, if a paper is accepted, there will be a reply by somebody from the other discipline. Not a reply in the sense everything you just said is wrong. So not the usual scrutiny, that's in the peer review. But in the cross-disciplinary review, the idea is to say, look, you are writing this, but for us that's nonsense because we would raise these sort of questions. Or how very interesting that you're thinking this way. We would look at it this way. And the idea is to really help both disciplines to understand each other's assumptions and methodology. So I was invited because of this chapter, the issue of bias, the framing powers of machine learning. And that's what I want to talk about the difference between productive bias, wrongful or unfair bias. I will very briefly touch on unlawful bias. I've written a lot about law and computer science. But I will now focus mostly on, let's say, more theoretical and methodological issues. This is where the book, the chapter is published or going to be published. It's coming out later this year. So here's what I'm going to talk about. Trying to take the perspective of computer science and hoping that you will correct me when I'm finished, taking the perspective of ethics. So what's unfair bias? That's the domain of ethics. Briefly touch on law, and then say something about why I believe that machine learning has framing powers. So first about productive bias. So there is something called profiling that is key to life. An organism, or let's draw it up a bit more broad, if we think that there will be artificial agents at some point, an agent that is to survive in the real world, that must be able to navigate the real world, must be profiling that world, that environment continuously. And you could quote Bateson, one of the founding fathers of cybernetics and artificial intelligence, as saying that it's all about detecting the difference that makes a difference. And making a difference is in terms of quite existential things, how to survive in an environment, but also how to flourish, of course. Bias is about pattern recognition. So any agent that is in an environment that it has to navigate in and to sustain its own agency needs to recognize patterns to prevent mishaps. And that means it cannot just go and detect anything that happens around it. It has to be focused. It has to detect the patterns that matter. And that means bias is a matter of life and death, or a matter of flourishing. That also means that cognition for an agent in a real environment is basically a matter of anticipation. So let's look at the philosopher Hume, who spoke of the inductive bias. He said, okay, every time
Is it me or?
we see the sun come up, that it is.
Hey, Mireille, we actually lost you for about 30 seconds. Well, again, I think.
Not pass cables here instead of glass fibers, so it happens sometimes. So yeah, it's Brussels, you know. So Gadamer, I will repeat, Gadamer, 20th century, beginning 20th century philosopher.
We lost you for about 1 minute. You were frozen, so we couldn't hear you. Can you?
Oh, okay, yes, I will go back.
Yeah.
I will get to know Gadamer better and better. So Gadamer is a philosopher of the first part of the 20th century. He's actually laid the foundations of modern hermeneutics. So that is the philosophical analysis of interpretation. And Gadamer said, without prejudice, and he said we should take away the negative, the pejorative association with the idea of prejudice. Without prejudice, we cannot act, we cannot cognize, and we cannot perceive anything. It's a bit similar to what Hume said, but it's slightly better elaborated. So basically building on, for instance, also Kant, but taking that further, he said, if you do not develop some framing, you will not be able to to navigate not just the physical world, but also the institutional world. Some people would say the social world that you navigate. And of course, this is in many ways similar, though not the same, as Karl Popper's position that any perception and cognition in science is necessarily theory laden. You can't just go to things and look at them like that. There is always a frame that allows you to see certain things, but necessarily also means that you're not seeing other things. So this is philosophy, and it was all about human cognition, human perception. Now let's look at what machine learning does when it starts to predict. There is the example of Wolpert's no free lunch theorems, where he basically, I'm now going to reduce an entire couple of papers to one statement. I'm going to compress them to one statement. The no free lunch theorem basically means that if we have developed an algorithm, we have trained it on specific data, and obvious, we cannot train on future data. It is comparable and in the same line as Tom Mitchell in his handbook on machine learning, where he says, if we do machine learning, we have to necessarily assume that the distribution of training and validation data, test data, is similar to that of future data. If we don't make that assumption, it makes no sense to do machine learning. But of course, we don't know that. So let's say, even within the tradition of machine learning from the mathematical side, like Wolpert and Mitchell in his textbook, there is the awareness that from a perspective of computer science, we need a certain modesty here. But at the same time, that modesty means that bias. So let's say that bias here means that we're picking out a particular distribution in the training data using machine learning technologies, that bias is generative of the results of machine learning. Of course, that bias is not necessarily projects to begin with, which aimed to be able, I can see my connection is unstable.
Yeah, we lost you again for another 30 seconds.
Okay, I'm going back again. So this paper is a review of over 2,000 studies where computer scientists tried to model, with the help of machine learning, X-rays of the chest, of the lungs, to be able to both diagnose and predict COVID. This was all people that were already in the hospital. And here you see the beginning of the data set, 2,000 papers, duplicates out, etc., etc., etc. The terrible thing is that in the end, after taking out all the studies that were basically methodologically weak, etc., they actually found no model that had enough quality to be of any help. And when I saw this and read the paper and tweeted about it, I immediately got response of people who said, yes, we can see that the editors of journals are not really doing their job. So they're sending out all sorts of papers, which means that reviewers were not always aware of all the methodological requirements that are in place, that a lot of papers actually get published that shouldn't be published. Of the 2,000 papers, part were published on archive, not yet peer-reviewed. Now, you could summarize and say that unproductive bias means that the potential applications of such research will lack the 4 R's. Resilience. If there's no resilience, there is no elasticity of the application in the face of new realities, no robustness. It would be brittle in the face of small perturbations. We all know about adversarial machine learning. It would not be reliable for, if it's not resilient and robust, then it may start behaving as one does not expect, and it may be not responsible in the sense of having adverse effects. Now let's move from the fact that bias in machine learning is productive, potentially, if done well, and could be unproductive if the machine learning research design has not been well developed or well implemented. Let's move and look at unfair bias. Just a little example to have a first taste of where I want to go. So in one of the previous issues of the communications of the ACM, there was this fun, envy-free cake cutting algorithm building on the idea that if you have 2 children and you have one piece of cake and they both want it very much, you ask one to cut it and the other to choose first. But as we all know, if there are more than 2 people, that may become very complex. It doesn't work like that. So these authors had worked out a certain solution. They said, okay, we will first do, of the first agent does an initial envy-free division of the cake, of a part that the cake. So instead of dividing the whole cake, they take a part, such a part that they can develop an envy-free division. And after that, with the part that has not been divided yet, they go about a series of steps. And then the end result is that nearly the whole cake can be divided in an envy-free way. So I'm going to give some assumptions that are at play here. If you want to claim that this is connected with fairness, I would say, okay, that's one particular definition of fairness. For that reason, it's very interesting. Of course, it's a nice puzzle, but let's look at the assumptions. The first assumption is that it is possible to develop an initial envy-free division of part of the cake. And that depends on all sorts of things, like, for instance, whether people are going to tell you and tell you correctly what are their preferences compared to others. The second, if it were possible, then you're going to assume that the other agents that are allowed to make the next steps, that they are fine with this initial division, because it may be that many different initial divisions were possible and that the next agent would have preferred to start with another one. As we all know, hopefully, famous legal and political philosopher John Rawls said, the whole trick with this sort of division is that we want to create incentives for agents to enlarge the cake. That's what the economy is about. So if an agent manages to enlarge the cake, that means there is more to divide, then those agents who manage to enlarge the cake get a slightly bigger share than others. Why? To stimulate innovation. So maybe if you manage such an envy-free cake cutting algorithm, you're stifling innovation, which some people think is the worst thing in the world. Now, what I find more interesting here is that the way this is framed, so we're talking about preferences, basically, is framed in terms of a specific form of utilitarianism. First, we assume that the preferences are given, then we have to assume that they are known somehow, and that they're stable, that people are not changing them all the time. Now, to do a puzzle, these are all very valid and wonderful assumptions, because otherwise it becomes difficult to do mathematics. But in real life, of course, these assumptions don't fly at all. The hidden assumption here are, these assumptions are part of social choice theory, which, for instance, also assumes that fairness can be reduced to a division problem, and that's not obvious at all. On top of that, this division problem is framed in terms of envy-free divisions, but all sorts of other goals might be there. You might think in terms of fairness, of giving everybody sufficient to make certain choices, to take care of others. You might want to have a certain difference between the people who get the best part and the not so best part, irrespective of their preferences, etc. The question is whether fairness has to do with preferences. Now, all this has to do with ethics. Fairness is part of ethics, and there is a long tradition in ethics, and it would be a bit silly to reinvent ethics, not looking into what has already been thought out. And the main reason for that is that if you do that, you're probably going to unconsciously follow one particular ethics that you were raised with, that is part of your common sense. Within the study of ethics, we usually discriminate between deontological ethics, so that's usually attributed to Kant, the idea that ethics is about duties that we have towards each other, where human autonomy is the most important value. Well, his ethics has been articulated by Kant himself as saying that you should never use another human being only for some sort of purpose. So many people forget the only, but let's say that he said we should not follow, when we're talking about fellow human beings, or rational agents, he said, in terms of a hypothetical imperative, but always in terms of a categorical imperative. We must always respect the autonomy of the person involved. So there is also virtue ethics. This goes back to Aristotle, but there's a lot of it in the last and this century. And it's basically about practical wisdom. I think it was Aristotle who said that if you're the best mathematician when you're around 18 or 20, after that it goes downhill. I'm sure you might want to contest that, but that's what he said. And he said, on the other hand, practical wisdom, which is about justice, but also about things like courage and an understanding of things that you basically can't calculate, but that are about judgment. That this sort of wisdom, practical wisdom, grows with age. Okay, very interesting. The third one is utilitarianism. I think in the UK and the United States, utilitarianism prevails. It's the main way of doing ethics, but it's also ingrained in a common sense. And basically it goes back to Bentham and to the idea of calculating what are one's duties. Let's go a bit deeper into utilitarianism. It's based on methodological atomism. So it's based on the idea that you can dissect interaction into behaviors that you can sort of qualify and separate such that you have atomic parts of behavior that then allow you to calculate. That means that utilitarianism and the methodology that underlies it has behaviorist assumptions. I will come back to that. It is also the big assumption of social and public choice theory, one of the Chicago schools, and nudge theory and behavioral economics, the other Chicago school. Both go back to utilitarian calculus and to behaviorist assumptions. Now, any choice here, any choice you make between different types of ethics frames the problem. And that framing also frames, and that means limits, potential solutions. Because utilitarianism basically thinks in terms of discrete preferences, it is, of course, very conducive to computer science perspectives because computer science is built on discrete entities to calculate with. Now, the fact that it is conducive to computational technologies makes it interesting. I think it can give us very interesting insights, but that does not imply that it is necessarily the best way to frame issues. Let's have a quick look at behaviorism. I always love this cartoon of Pavlov. Pavlov's kicked off behaviorism beginning of the last century. I'm sure you all know the stories of the dog, where he tried to show that certain behaviors also in animal are not innate, but are learned behavior. And basically he did laboratory experiments where he constrained the behavior in such a way that the dog could do little else than what he wanted and hoped that dog to do. And here we see the dog having its own ideas about who is conditioning who. So the Pavlov approach is usually summarized as a stimulus reflex theory, meaning you treat the animal as a manipulable mechanism. Again, we have here what I mentioned before, methodological atomism. So you try to cut behavior into these units with which you can calculate. And this methodological atomism gave rise to two series, and maybe we are now in the third one, of Methodenstreit, mainly in sociology and economics, last part of the 19th century, first half of the 20th century, where the social sciences tried to be like the natural sciences. So they wanted to be scientific in the sense of being calculable. I'll give you a quote of Watson, one of the big men of behaviorism from 1930, where he says, it's in the interest of the behaviorist in man's doings to be more than a spectator, because the behaviorist wants to control man's reactions, just like physical scientists want to control, manipulate other natural phenomena. It's the business of behaviorist psychology to be able to predict and control human activity. Now, of course, that is very much related with cybernetics and other behaviorists like Skinner, for instance, but also present day sociologists who are basically working with computational social physics, people like Pentland, Helbing, and actually also people like Sunstein. You could ask the question, what could possibly go wrong? Why not play around with cutting up human behavior into discrete, measurable entities that you can then feed into machine learning research design and draw all sorts of conclusions? Well, maybe this is what can go wrong. So this is the website that you can go to today. It's the My Personality database that this is the rest of the website that was created by David Stilwell in 2007. It was an application on top of Facebook where you could, if you gave certain permissions, you could fill out a survey and then discover what sort of personality you had. And around 6 million people volunteered, and well, great fun, isn't it? This is part of a niche in the science of psychology. That niche is called psychometrics. So it's built on these behavior assumptions. And what could possibly wrong is what also went wrong, because this is the database employed by Cambridge Analytica. I could say a lot about that, and maybe that's, I'm going to leave that to the discussion because I want to move on. But I think that trying to cut up people's actions like that and then trying to manipulate them in the end does not work, because there are assumptions about human interaction that don't fly here, and those assumptions result in the fact that you can't manipulate people into doing what you want them to do, but you can definitely manipulate the whole public infosphere, so the public sphere, the ecosystem of information, in such a way that everybody becomes entirely confused. Back to unfair bias, let me quote, take some examples from chapter 11 of the book I wrote, because I've been teaching law to master students of computer science for 8 years, which, by the way, was party time, because computer scientists, in my experience, have a sense of complexity. They understand that in the context of a multi-dimensional complex system like law, if you change something here, it will ripple through the system. So they have an enormous understanding of complexity, unexpected behavior, and a difficulty for instance, a judge to make certain decisions. In my experience, most computer scientists that I taught also understand the limits of disambiguating things and turning natural language into computer code. But let me go to the 11th chapter of that book, which is the validation of that course. And it's about the relationship between ethics, code, and law. Let's now take the example of Compass. Not because you've not heard of it, you know much better and much more about it, I'm sure. But I want to give you my perspective. So this is about correctional offender management, profiling for alternative sanctions. It's a system that has been used in many states in the United States to make decisions, to help make decisions about whether somebody has to be detained or released. And there are many other factors that feed into that decision, but the possibility that somebody might recidivize is one of those features. I've come to understand that the term recidivize doesn't exist, but I hope you understand.
Nếu hôm nay lại mặc áo hay gì?
Excuse me? Can you hear me?
I think there was somebody unmuted and I just muted.
Okay. Yeah. Please, questions.
I guess we do have one question. Like, Rachel, do you want to ask?
Yeah, I do have a question because I'm not a social scientist. I'm just curious, but like when we look at anything, a basis of it is our language, no matter which discipline we are in, right? No matter we're computer science or we're social scientist or we're economist, the basis of our language, our English language is discrete in some sense. We have adjectives about people's personality, and in some sense, computer science may actually add kind of a number for every adjective, like how much a person envy, And that's actually continuous number. So if you want to say you don't want to view human behavior in a discrete manner, like how do we overcome that in any discipline, given our language is discrete?
Yes, so of course you can make language discrete, but I think natural language is not discrete at all. It is discrete in some sense, like if I write down a word, then it is discrete in the sense that it is that word and not another word. If you want to call that discrete, it is definitely discrete. If you want to know the meaning of that word, you will have to look at the intra-linguistic meaning. So you would have to, if you ask me the meaning of that word, I'm going to use other words, right? So it's connected with a whole web of other terms. And at the same time, if it has to be meaningful in any sense, it will have to refer also to extra-linguistic meaning. And that can be a table or a chair or an institution like marriage, contract, property, right? So in that striking that intra and extra systematic web of meaning that is continuously changing as we speak, because your understanding, if we speak the same language, of that term will always be slightly different because you grew up in a slightly different web of meaning. Now that ambiguity that is inherent in natural language is actually extremely productive of meaning. It means that meaning is continuously shifting and adapting. Now, of course, you can take a piece of language, a corpus, treat it as data, and then, for instance, do natural language processing on it. And you can say, well, there are some psychologists who think that a personality can be distinguished in the ocean set. There's lots of anthropological and other research that defies this. It's a controversial way of looking at things, but sure, it's one way of looking at things. And then you could try to map that in a way that is non-ambiguous, because otherwise the machine is not going to understand it, the computer. And then you can start calculating, and you can start ranking, for instance, and saying, well, this person on openness, for instance, scores 4 out of 5. And you might ask 7 different people, and one might say, well, that person is 3 out of 5. The other says, I think 4 out of 5. The person themselves might say 5 out of 5. And here we have the first problem. What is the ground truth here? Let's take the average. What does that mean? So what I'm trying to say is, I'm trying to pick out all these assumptions. And I'm trying to say that all the models that are built are based on certain assumptions. If the assumptions fly, then the model input, output might work. But if the assumptions don't fly, then we have a problem. And that's what I want to pick out. And I want to make sure that when these models are built and then built into applications that have a real impact into the real world, that the people who don't understand computer science don't get the wrong idea, that they understand that this is built based on assumptions that maybe don't fly at all. And it is important that this insight, which as far as I know, most computer scientists sort of take for granted because they know what they're doing. It is very important to share that with non-computer scientists in such a way that people don't say, oh, that means it's not objective, or that's not true. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you can map, model, frame the same thing, like personality aspect, like openness, in many different ways. One way might enable you to build a machine learning model on that. As long as we see that that is one way of framing the problem, if it is a problem, that it's one way of framing this, we're good. And then we should, of course, at some point, if we're going to apply that to give people a job or not, or to try and nudge people into certain types of behavior, we should try and discuss whether the assumptions actually fly. And let me tell you, that's controversial within the science of psychology. So this is the main message of my talk.
Yeah, definitely.
Shall I continue, or?
Please, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm going to try, I'm just going to have a look at the clock, because I think it is very interesting to have the discussions. And I see that it's already 6:45 here. So I'm going to go a bit faster, right? So that we have at least some time to have questions. Okay, so COMPASS is about the risk that an offender recidivizes. They developed the model based on testing of 137 features, and 6 out of them were said to be predictive. This is used for detain or release decisions. And it turned out that because of the fact that more Black people recidivize, according to the data, that though black and white predictions or predictions for Black and white people were similar qua accuracy, they were nevertheless inverse. So Black more often false negatives and white more often false positives. And that ended up, as Julie Angwin in ProPublica said, our analysis found that Black defendants who did not recidivize over a 2-year period were nearly twice as likely to be misclassified as higher risk compared to their white counterparts. Now, this was the COMPASS issue. Now, there are 3 issues here. The question whether the COMPASS output algorithm, so the algorithm that is used by the courts, that is based on the machine learning research design of North Point, a firm, a commercial firm, whether that is indeed accurate, and what this means from a computational perspective, because it may be accurate, but the precision or the specificity may be less perfect, right? Now, this is another question from whether the algorithm is unfair, because the question is, what does that mean? And how could we formalize that in a way that makes it feasible to do computations? And maybe the most interesting question is whether the answers to the previous questions are objective, and if they are, in what sense? Now, North Point, who developed the algorithm and who's selling it to the court, says, this is statistics. Because the Black people recidivize more often, that's simply what you get if you know your statistics well. Now, I would say, well, that depends on how you train your learner algorithm. If you make as a task to ensure that all defendants who do not recidivize have the same error rate, both for false and positive and false negatives, in both cases, and so across Black and white defendants, then the learner algorithm, of course, will learn just that. And we all know that there are many other ways to frame fairness here, maybe 21, maybe by now 99. So the underlying question here in this particular case is whether it is unfair to judge a Black person based on the fact that other Black persons, according to the data, more often recidivize than white people, or whether it is unfair that a white person who will recidivize benefits from the fact, generally speaking, according to the data, white people recidivize less often than Black people. So this is formulated in a way that people who are not computer scientists understand the issue. And in this case, we can't have our cake and eat it too. A choice will have to be made between these 2 types of fairness. With fairness, you always have to ask the question, fairness compared to whom? Of course, from a computer science perspective, you can formalize both and make them operational. But of course, it's not up to computer scientists to decide for society what is fair. And that makes it difficult for computer scientists to perform closure here, to make the final decision. But of course, what computer scientists can do is to explain the implications of the design choices and their trade-offs. Maybe if you follow the kind of fairness that I just explained, that might mean that more Black people will be released, and that there are both Black and white people, they're going to be the victim. So fairness in terms of victims, what does that mean? So it's important that computer scientists who develop these sort of models explain the implications of design choices and their trade-offs, and to develop further and other ways to train learner algorithms in ways that could reduce similar types of unfairness. And I'm sure you know much more about how to do that computationally. So defining unfairness in a way that amends for both prejudice and for the result of previous unfair treatment and other root causes of recidivism is not an easy task. And that's not the case when human beings try to assess the likelihood of recidivism, and also not when a computer does it. In both cases, the problem sits in the shift from an assessment at aggregate level to individual level. In psychology, we call that stereotyping, and medical research, of course, tells us that what is reasonable at the level of epidemiology may be off-key at the individual level. Very briefly about lawful, I'm not really going to say very much about it. Fairness by design as an approach in law, we have to listen to two warnings. To claim that an algorithm can make decisions fair is to overstate what algorithms can do in this space. Because we may not agree on what is fair. For that reason, it may be better to develop a countering unfairness by design approach. So these tools should not be used to replace legal judgment, but to challenge it, to enhance the practical wisdom of the court, instead of taking over and diminishing it. And for that reason, lawyers and computer scientists should sit down together to write code that keeps courts nimble and sharp. Okay, so any type, I'm finishing, any type of machine learning research design frames output, depends on the type, quality, and completeness of the data. The framing sits in the labeling. Was there bias in the selection of label? Was there bias in the application of the label? So the laborious work of actually labeling data. If we're using supervised, the choice of the proxy for the purpose that you have with the system. So defining the task in machine readable way, there will be bias there. The hypothesis space, the sort of mathematical functions, models that you're using. If you're using one type, you're not using another type. The choice of the loss function. Or you're talking about accuracy or about sensitivity and precision, and different varieties here. Any type of machine learning research design frames the input by choosing, constructing a ground truth, deciding whether you have a gold standard or have to make do with a diamond standard in terms of training data, developing your baseline, deciding your baseline. Are you going to work with low-hanging fruit, data that is irrelevant but available? And of course, no, you won't, but in practice it happens all the time. We know that. Especially when stuff has to be commercialized. So data, model, metrics, ground truth, and baseline define what you make visible, but also what you make invisible. And that's not just risky in terms of physical harm that applications like self-driving cars or the IoT have, but it hides choices that are relevant to decide on fairness, and it prompts invisible visibility, so visibility for whoever is using the system, and invisible invisibility for whoever is targeted by that system. And in turn, the output will inform the world via the behavior of the application. Now, this training power must be communicated in sufficient detail. For instance, via standards like CLAIM, PROBAST, and TRIPHET that are used in medical machine learning research, validation. And I've been working very hard to look for similar standards, assessment checklists outside the medical sphere, but I don't find them. And I think it will be very important to link this sort of assessment to the legal framework, to decide on liability certification, etc., to say, okay, if you've not done your homework according to this checklist, then you have a problem. And that's important because otherwise we end up with this situation. And that's my last slide, isn't it? Yes. And I could say so much more, but ooh, we just have 4 minutes. So now I'm nevertheless very hungry for your questions and comments.
Thanks for the great talk. Do you have any questions?
Have I been so terribly clear or different, or please? I'm very robust, so, or resilient, so you can just throw it in my face.
Okay, since you're asking, one question I'm wondering, I mean, there was at some point a claim about somebody or a field claiming that fairness is all about resource allocation or resource division. And I wonder, where does that come from? Sometimes when you speak, I feel that you have a straw computer scientist that you argue with that doesn't exist. And that looked to me like an example of that.
Oh no, so the example I gave of the, so you know Arrow's theorem, undoubtedly, and the example I gave of the envy-free cake cutting algorithm, that's about division. But another example of...
yeah, so that statement, who said that fairness is all about division?
No. So this particular example is about division. If you, for instance, take the moral machine game that has been up with MIT and was played by everybody, that's another wonderful example of a game that is entirely based on assumptions of both utilitarianism, so thinking in terms of cost and benefits, in terms of preferences, and in terms of behaviorism. Now, I don't know if you want to call that division. I don't think you have to call that division. Ultimately, these sort of approaches are based on discretizing either preferences or human behavior. If you can't discretize it, you can't calculate, right? So it's obvious. I understand that if you're a computer scientist and you want to if you want to frame fairness as a mathematical problem, that you have to discretize. That's obvious. I don't think anybody can suggest otherwise. The only thing I'm saying is that maybe there are many other ways of framing a problem. You don't have to discretize, and maybe the misunderstanding that then evolves between not just computer scientists, but many other behaviorists and economists, for instance, of both Chicago School, is that some people want to only talk about what can be discretized, but that's like the man who lost his keys and who's looking on a lamppost. You know.
Let me ask a terminology question, because I think this might. What do you mean by discretize? The way you're using it, I think maybe you mean what we would call formalize, like mathematize. But you're not trying to make a distinction between the discrete and the continuous, are you? You mean what can be sort of formalized mathematically?
I think the two are connected, so I'm sure that you can formalize and then deny that you have to first discretize, because you can, it's like if you show me a photograph that consists of discrete pixels, right? You can make the pixels so small that you don't see anymore that it's discrete, but nevertheless it's discrete. So to formalize, you have to disambiguate, and to disambiguate, you have to discretize.
My understanding is somewhat similar. I'm thinking like I feel that it's not about discretization. It's more about computer science make it certain. Like there's a number that is certain about the meaning of a particular, the quantity of a quality or the quantity itself. Whereas at least the example you give me about the language and different understanding, there's people can understand the same thing differently, means it's not certain. Like there may be some operational things you can do. This person is more open than the other one, but how open each person is, it's not certain. And every situation is actually going to derive different answers based on whatever the particular context and the language and the culture. And
yes, I would say if you
robustness is not there. Yeah.
If you use, for instance, the ocean model, and you're going to rank, and you're going to say 3 out of 5, 2 out of 5, or you're going to say fair. I'm now going to formalize fair so that something is either fair or not fair. I would say that's discretization in the end, but also in the beginning, right? And of course, the term discretization sort of proved my point. I'm sure that within computer science, the term has a very unambiguous meaning, though maybe that also depends on the math, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe even the term discretization itself, are we talking mathematics here, number theory, computer science, which part of computer science? So my focus, to go back to the talk, is machine learning. And in this case, if you are trying to develop a system that is able to calculate with behavior, like we're now surrounded by systems that are continuously reading our behaviors, and they often have to do that based on proxies, because something like openness doesn't have any unambiguous meaning. So you have to find a proxy that you can tell the machine so that it will say, this is openness. And for me, that's all fine, but it means you are modeling. And you are modeling, in this case, a human person. Let's say that a human person is a system. Even that is debatable, but let's say a human person is a system. So you're modeling that system in terms of personality, and you're doing that in this case, openness, 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5. So that's what I call discrete. And my problem is that you're making design decisions, and whoever is going to label things and decide what is openness and what is not openness, or the extent of the openness, so the ranking, is making all sorts of decisions that have trade-offs further down the stream. And it's so important that that this insight is shared, because I'm sure you're not surprised about it. I'm not telling you anything new, right? If you want to build a model, these are all assumptions you have to make. Otherwise, you can't calculate. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it's framing things. So now I'm trying to shut up. Aaron, did that in any way answer your question?
So I feel like we all probably agree, but there's a terminology barrier. So I think like one thing probably we all agree on is that, you know, whenever you are doing math that's supposed to say something about the world, you are in fact doing math about, you know, within some model, which is very much an imperfect model of the world. And to the extent that it has anything to do with the world, you have to be very clear about what are the modeling assumptions. I think that is entirely distinct from, and this might be the terminology issue, this issue of discretization versus continuity. And then there's something you said that sort of, you know, machine learning models can't reason about uncertainty, you know, and you have to like put everything in, you know, like box 1 or box 2, which I think is, you know, taken literally not true. Of course,
I didn't
these models
use
are
the term uncertainty. Somebody else used that to explain me. I didn't use it, but
got it. So I mean, of course, like we can write down, and we do all the time, mathematical models that deal with sort of continuous quantities like probabilities. We can talk about degrees of belief in things, but I mean, I think the thing that
so for me,
we all
maybe
agree on is that when we're doing math, we're doing it within a, you know, stylized model that is only partially connected to the real world through the particular assumptions it's made.
I think for me, discrete is opposite of analog. Not, I mean, even if you look at mathematics, I think there are many, and now I'm missing the language, but if you think about continuity within mathematics and probability theory, for instance, of course you can do that. But if you compare it with the, let's say, the analog world, whatever that is, but the world that we actually breathe in, then there is a translation issue. And a translation always means you gain something and you lose something. And actually, my main point is that it is important to, of course, acknowledge that something gets lost, and also acknowledge that something is gained, and to be more precise about that, and to see how that. So I spoke about the framing problem. There are actually 2 levels of the framing problem. So the first level is that you have to find proxies from, let's call it the analog to the digital world. And the second level is when you are then in that digital world, what you want to model the analog world, you have to continuously work with proxies, and those proxies are going to frame your output. And that is, again, not saying that there is something wrong with that, but I think it will greatly help to build systems that actually challenge people instead of replacing them. That's my last statement is, we need this software to challenge us so that we become more aware of our own prejudice, for instance, instead of replacing us, which will make us dumber, right?
So I think I generally agree with everything you're saying, except I still can't figure out the connection. Like, as far as I can tell, it has nothing to do with the difference between digital or analog, or the difference between discrete and continuous. Like, all of the rest of the words you've said, I agree with, and I think we can excise this part of it. And we're in it.
Then let's be agnostic about all that, because I know there are, you know, if you're a Platonist, then you'll probably deny there is such a difference. And my way of solving that problem is saying, okay, I'm willing to be agnostic about whether that difference matters. As long as it is clear to everybody that when you work within computer science and you're designing, you're doing a research design and you're doing the research and then building applications, that there are all these assumptions that probably don't fly. And then don't fly in the sense that you have to work with proxies. And then learn how to help people who are not computer scientists and who don't even understand what an assumption is here, to deal with that and to learn and to not throw out the kid with the bathwater.
Yes. So I think, I mean, this is a good general statement about the exercise of mathematical modeling generally. But I think is not specific to computer science or computers or discrete things. These are good criticisms of the exercise of mathematical modeling and good things for anyone who's trying to understand mathematical models to understand.
Perhaps even beyond mathematical models, it may be right thing to, with respect to all our attempts to understand things that are complicated, and even if we understand them, through math, through language, through the lens of any of the disciplines that is interested, through the lens of law, through the lens of sociology, through every of these lenses, we need, so I would argue that we need modesty from all.
Absolutely, I totally agree.
All, yeah, good.
The problem is, of course, that these computational systems have to be sold because people want to be funded or people just want to get rich. It happens, right? And then, especially when you're talking about proprietary stuff, people are not going to talk about the assumptions. They are not going to, Mark Zuckerberg is not going to explain to us what his assumptions are when building a social network. And going into more detail, I mean, look at the Cambridge Analytica case. The assumptions there are the assumptions of psychometrics. That's a niche thing in psychology that most psychologists will say, well, yeah, okay, these people are sitting there and doing things. Let them have fun. It's their playpen. But it's no longer a playpen. It's affecting us. So I agree with Aaron that, yes, you could say this about math in general, but now it's having effects, real effects. And then it becomes even more important that people learn to understand both the limits of computer science and the productiveness. So for me, bias is not bad. It can be bad, of course, but it's bias that we need. Otherwise, we don't get any output. The system has to recognize, if you feed a system more data, you will get more spurious patterns, right? If you're stupid.
I have a point of order. Perhaps I would stop the recording, and then whoever wants to stay, I'll be happy to continue. This is a fascinating discussion, but what do the organizers think?
Sure, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can continue.
Yeah, we should stop the recording, and everyone who wants to stick around can stick around. But yeah, we're way past the official end time.
Yes.
So